It was one of those bright Saturday mornings when the town felt alive again after a long week. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through Main Street, mixing with the faint sound of car doors slamming and laughter from people heading into the weekend farmers market. It was the kind of morning that made people slow down, smile, and enjoy the small moments. Everyone except one person. Helen Brooks stepped out of her shiny white SUV like she was walking onto a red carpet. Her sunglasses reflected the sunlight, and her handbag, perfectly matched to her shoes, swung at her side as if she was making an entrance. She wasn't just anyone, at least not in her mind. She was the mayor's wife, and in her world that meant she could do what she wanted, whenever she wanted. She parked her car in the loading zone directly in front of a small cafe called The Daily Grind. A big red sign right next to her car clearly said, "No parking, loading zone only." But Helen didn't even glance at it. She turned off the engine, gave a quick look in the mirror, fixed her hair, and smiled at her reflection. Rules were for other people, not for her. Across the street, an older man sitting on a bench noticed what she'd done. He muttered under his breath but didn't say anything. Everyone in town knew who she was, and most people had learned it was easier to stay quiet than get into a confrontation. Helen had a reputation. Inside the cafe, people were chatting, reading newspapers, or scrolling through their phones. It was the usual Saturday crowd, families, students, and a few regulars who came every weekend for their favorite brew. The baristas were busy behind the counter trying to keep up with the morning rush. Helen pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled softly. Conversation slowed just a little when people noticed her. She carried herself with an air of importance, the kind that filled the room before she even said a word. "Good morning," one of the baristas greeted warmly. Helen didn't respond. She went straight to the counter, looking up at the menu as if she had never seen it before, though she had been there many times. "I'll take a caramel latte, large, extra shot of espresso, and make sure it's not too hot," she said, her tone sharp but precise. The young man behind the counter nodded. "Sure thing, ma'am. That'll be $5.90. Helen sighed and opened her wallet. "Do I really need to pay? I'm sure my husband has spent enough at city events to cover this entire place." The barista, trying to stay polite, smiled awkwardly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but everyone pays for their drinks here." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Do you know who I am?" A few people nearby turned their heads slightly. The barista swallowed and nodded nervously. "Yes, ma'am, of course. I still need to ring it up, though." Helen finally handed over a bill, muttering something under her breath about people not respecting authority anymore. While waiting for her drink, she glanced around the cafe, noticing a young couple laughing together near the window. Their laughter annoyed her for no reason she could explain. She rolled her eyes and looked away. Then she saw a mother with two kids trying to find a table. The mother gave her a small, friendly smile, but Helen didn't return it. When her drink was finally ready, the barista called out, "Caramel latte for Helen." Helen walked up, picked up the cup, and took a sip immediately. Her face twisted. "This is too hot," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I told you not to make it too hot. Can't anyone follow simple instructions?" The barista apologized and offered to make another one. "I can remake it right away for you, ma'am." "Just a minute," Helen shook her head. "Forget it. I don't have time for incompetence." She placed the cup down with more force than necessary, spilling a little coffee on the counter. Everyone around tried to ignore her, but the tension was noticeable. The same older man who had been sitting outside earlier had come in to order his drink. He looked at Helen and then at the barista, clearly uncomfortable with the way she was behaving. Helen, still fuming, took out her phone and started typing something furiously. Probably a text to her husband or a post complaining about poor service. She didn't notice that the cafe manager, a calm woman named Lila, had come out from the back. "Is everything okay here?" Lila asked gently. Helen turned her attention to her. "No, it's not. Your staff clearly doesn't know how to treat people properly. I asked for a simple drink and I got this." She pointed at the coffee cup like it was evidence in a trial. Lila kept her tone even. "I'm sorry to hear that. We can fix it for you right away." But Helen wasn't interested in an apology.
"Do you even train these kids?"
"Or do you just hire anyone who walks in off the street?" The barista looked down, embarrassed. Lila took a slow breath. She wanted to keep things calm. "Ma'am, our staff works very hard and we do our best to take care of every customer." Helen crossed her arms. Well, maybe you should try harder. I'll be sure to mention this to my husband. I'm sure the mayor would like to know how his wife was treated in one of his town businesses. A few whispers rippled through the cafe. People exchanged looks. This wasn't the first time she'd pulled that card. Lila, though clearly annoyed, didn't rise to it. Thank you for your feedback, ma'am, she said simply. Helen rolled her eyes, turned around, and walked out, pushing the door open harder than necessary. The bell above the door jingled again, but this time it sounded sharp instead of cheerful. Outside, her car was still sitting in the loading zone. A delivery truck driver was trying to pull up to unload boxes for the grocery store next door. He honked lightly, hoping she would notice and move. She didn't. Instead, she opened her car door slowly, taking her time as if daring him to say something. The driver, a middle-aged man who looked tired from a long morning of deliveries, shook his head and muttered something. Helen turned toward him. "Excuse me?" she called out. He sighed. "Ma'am, I just need to use the loading zone for a few minutes. It's marked for deliveries only." Helen gave a little laugh. "I'll just be a minute. You'll survive." The driver bit his tongue, deciding not to argue. He'd heard stories about her. It wasn't worth the trouble. Helen got into her car, adjusted her mirrors, and started scrolling on her phone before turning the key. She didn't even notice that the cafe windows were filled with quiet onlookers shaking their heads. Inside, Lila leaned against the counter and looked at her team. "Everyone okay?" she asked softly. The young barista nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine." It's not the first time she's been rude. One of the regulars at a nearby table said, "You handled that well." "I don't know how you stay so calm." Lila smiled a little. "You learn after a while. Some people just need to be seen acting powerful, because they don't know how to feel important otherwise." The conversation drifted back to normal after that. The cafe's soft music filled the air again, and people returned to their coffees and conversations. But the mood had shifted. Moments like that left a mark. Outside, Helen finally drove off, her tires brushing the curb. The delivery driver sighed in relief and pulled his truck into the now empty space. As she drove down Main Street, Helen still felt irritated. In her mind, she hadn't done anything wrong. She was just demanding what she deserved. She often told herself that she had worked hard to reach her position, though it was really her husband's title that gave her influence. But she liked the feeling of being in control. Back home, she lived in a large house on the hill overlooking the town. People often joked that it was big enough to be a small hotel. She loved hosting events there, charity dinners, political gatherings, and garden parties where she could show off her taste and connections. To her, appearances were everything, but behind the polished smiles and fancy clothes, Helen was restless. She needed constant attention to feel validated. When people didn't treat her like she was special, she felt invisible, and that was something she couldn't stand. That morning at the cafe was just another moment in a long pattern of small acts that revealed who she really was. To most people, it was a brief scene they would shake their heads about and move on. But for Helen, it was another step in a slow downfall she didn't see coming. Because in a town that small, every action got noticed. Every rude remark, every entitled gesture, every time she reminded people who she was, it all added up. People talked quietly, shared stories, and waited for the day someone would finally stand up to her. And that day wasn't far away. For now, though Helen enjoyed the drive home, sipping her too-hot coffee and muttering about how ungrateful people were these days, she didn't know that her behavior at that little cafe would soon come back to her in a way she never expected. It was only a matter of time before her attitude met someone who wouldn't back down. The next weekend, the same cafe was buzzing again. Saturday mornings were always the busiest time. The air was filled with the smell of roasted coffee beans and the low hum of quiet conversations. The same delivery trucks came and went. The same regulars sat by the windows, and the same group of young baristas hustled behind the counter, trying to keep up with the steady stream of customers. Inside, the atmosphere felt warm and welcoming. The barista from the previous week was back behind the counter, smiling and chatting with a few regulars. The memory of Helen's outburst had faded into one of those, "Did you see that?" stories people quietly whispered about but didn't dwell on. But the quiet wouldn't last long. Just before 9:30, the sound of sharp heels echoed on the pavement outside. Heads turned slightly toward the door almost instinctively. The glass door opened and there she was again. Helen Brooks holding her phone to her ear and speaking loudly enough for everyone inside to hear. No. I told him to move that meeting to Monday. I can't waste my Saturday on city business, she said as she walked in. Her voice carried across the cafe, breaking the calm rhythm of the morning. The barista behind the counter took a deep breath and straightened his apron. He had learned his lesson from last time. Just stay polite, stay calm, and get through it. Helen ended her call with an exaggerated sigh and looked around. The line was longer than she liked. She wasn't used to waiting. She frowned, adjusted her sunglasses, and walked straight past the people already in line. Excuse me, a young woman near the front said softly. There's a line. Helen didn't even glance at her. I just need to order quickly. My husband's the mayor, I'm sure it's fine. The room went quiet. People exchanged looks, some rolling their eyes, others whispering to each other. The barista, trying to keep his composure, smiled nervously. Good morning, ma'am. What can I get started for you? He asked. Helen spoke like she was giving orders to a personal assistant. Large caramel latte again, and this time make it drinkable, not boiling. He nodded and entered the order without saying more. The woman who had spoken up earlier just shook her head and stepped back. A few seconds later, the door opened again. A tall woman walked in, wearing a simple blazer and carrying a folder under her arm. Her name was Alicia Grant. She was a well-known attorney in town and served on the local Civil Rights Advisory Board. She had come by the cafe after a morning meeting at the courthouse, hoping for a quick coffee before heading home. Alicia was friendly, calm, and respected by almost everyone who knew her. She believed in treating people kindly no matter who they were. When she stepped inside and saw Helen standing at the counter with her sharp tone and impatient sighs, she didn't think much of it at first. She'd seen entitled behavior before. It came with her line of work. But when Helen began raising her voice again, Alicia's attention turned fully toward her. Is this really what you call service? Helen said loudly. I've been waiting almost 3 minutes for a simple drink. This is ridiculous, the barista replied softly. It's almost ready, ma'am. We're just finishing the milk now. Helen folded her arms. Unbelievable. People in this town have no sense of urgency. The man standing next to Alicia whispered, That's the mayor's wife. She does this all the time. Alicia gave a small nod but stayed quiet. She didn't like jumping into other people's conflicts unless it was necessary. When Helen's drink was finally placed on the counter, the barista said kindly, Here you go, ma'am. Helen picked it up, took one sip, and made a face again. Still too hot. Are you people incapable of following directions? She snapped. The cafe fell silent once again. The young barista looked flustered but still calm. I'm sorry, ma'am. I can make another one for you right away. Helen slammed the cup down, splashing some coffee on the counter. Forget it. You're hopeless. Alicia took a small step forward. Her voice was steady and gentle. Ma'am, maybe it would help if you spoke to him more kindly. He's doing his job. Helen turned her head slowly toward her. Excuse me? I wasn't talking to you. I know, Alicia said, but everyone can hear you. Helen narrowed her eyes. And who exactly do you think you are lecturing me in public? Alicia kept her tone polite. Just someone who thinks people deserve respect no matter who's ordering the coffee. A few quiet chuckles came from the tables in the back, but Alicia didn't smile. She wasn't trying to embarrass Helen. She just didn't like watching someone be humiliated for no reason. Helen, on the other hand, took it as a personal attack. You have no idea who you're speaking to, she said, her voice rising. My husband is the mayor of this town. I could make one call and have this entire place inspected tomorrow if I wanted to. Alicia looked her directly in the eye. You could, but that wouldn't make you right. The barista looked nervous, unsure of what to do. The cafe manager, Lila, who had been in the back preparing supplies, heard the noise and came out again. When she saw who was involved, her face tightened slightly. Is there a problem here? She asked carefully. Helen turned to her. Yes, this woman is trying to cause a scene. Alicia shook her head slightly. No scene, ma'am. Just asking for a little kindness in public. Lila looked between them and then glanced at the crowd of people pretending not to watch. Let's all take a breath, she said. We can remake the drink or refund it, whatever you prefer. Helen glared at Alicia for a long moment before snapping. Fine, I'm done here. This place is a joke anyway. She grabbed her purse and stormed out the door, muttering about how people like that always tried to make her look bad. The cafe stayed quiet for a few seconds after she left. Then someone whispered, "That was wild," and nervous laughter rippled through the room. Lila looked at Alicia with appreciation. "Thanks for trying to calm her down," she said softly. Alicia smiled faintly. "No problem. I just don't like seeing people treated that way." The barista nodded. "I really appreciate it too. She's like that every time she comes in. It's exhausting." Alicia took her order, a simple black coffee, and paid, leaving a generous tip in the jar before sitting near the window. As she sipped her drink, she could see Helen through the glass outside, standing by her car, clearly upset and talking loudly on her phone again. From inside, it looked like she was arguing with someone, probably her husband. She waved her hands in frustration, pointing toward the cafe as if blaming it for her bad mood. A few minutes later, Helen hung up, got in her car, and started the engine. The problem was, her car was still parked in the same loading zone she had used last time. A delivery truck was waiting behind her, honking lightly to get her attention. She ignored it. Instead, she opened her window and yelled, "I'll move when I'm ready." Alicia watched the scene quietly, shaking her head. The irony wasn't lost on her. People like Helen often thought power gave them permission to be rude. But real power, Alicia believed, was shown in how someone treated others, especially those who couldn't fight back. The truck driver, tired of waiting, finally called the local parking enforcement number. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up. The officer, a calm-looking man, stepped out and walked toward Helen's SUV. He tapped lightly on her window. "Ma'am, you can't park here. This is a loading-only zone," he said politely. Helen lowered her sunglasses. "I'm aware. I was just grabbing a coffee. Do you know who I am?" The officer's tone didn't change. "I understand, ma'am, but you've been here for over 10 minutes. I'll need to issue a citation if you don't move right now." Helen looked stunned. "Are you serious?" "My husband is the mayor." "I know, ma'am," the officer said calmly. "But the law applies to everyone, even the mayor's family." Alicia, still inside, took a small sip of her coffee and smiled quietly to herself. The officer's tone was firm but professional. No shouting, no drama. Just fairness. Helen, on the other hand, was furious. She started her car and sped off, tires screeching a little as she turned the corner. The officer shook his head and began writing something down on his notepad before returning to his car. Back inside the cafe, people began talking again. The tension melted away, replaced by a sense of quiet satisfaction. Lila turned to Alicia and said softly, "Thank you again." "Not everyone would have stepped in like that," Alicia smiled. "Sometimes silence feels like approval. I couldn't just stand there." Before she left, a few people stopped her to say thank you. Not for anything dramatic, just for showing decency in a moment when it was needed. As Alicia walked out, she noticed the delivery driver finally unloading his boxes, humming to himself. The world had gone back to normal, but something had shifted. Word spread quickly in small towns, and by the end of that day, almost everyone had heard about what happened. The mayor's wife, the shouting, the officer, and the calm woman who didn't back down. Alicia didn't think much of it. To her, it was just a simple moment of standing up for what's right. But for Helen, it was the beginning of something much bigger, a moment that would soon spiral far beyond what she ever expected. And that, though she didn't know it yet, was only the start. The following week started quietly in town, but the memory of what happened at the cafe was still fresh in many people's minds. Small towns had a way of carrying stories faster than any newspaper ever could. By Monday morning, everyone seemed to have a version of the story. The mayor's wife shouting in public, the calm lawyer who stood up to her, and the police officer who refused to give her special treatment. In City Hall, whispers filled the hallways before the mayor even arrived. Staff members spoke in low voices, glancing at one another as they worked. No one wanted to be caught gossiping about the mayor's wife, but the story was too big to ignore. When the mayor, Thomas Brooks, finally walked in that morning, he noticed the looks right away. He was a man used to respect and quiet nods when he entered a room, not the uneasy glances and half smiles he got that day. He set his briefcase down, straightened his tie, and called his assistant in. "What's going on?" he asked. His assistant hesitated before answering. "It's about Mrs. Brooks, sir. There was an incident over the weekend. At the cafe again?" Thomas rubbed his forehead. "What kind of incident?" She had a disagreement with a customer and the staff. Someone filmed it on their phone and it's been spreading online. The mayor sighed deeply. Of course they did, he muttered. He sat down, scrolling through his phone as his assistant pulled up the clip. The video wasn't long, just a few seconds of Helen raising her voice, Alicia stepping in, and then the officer outside writing a ticket. But it was enough. The comment section below was filled with reactions. Some people defended her, saying she must have been provoked. Others were less forgiving, calling her entitled, rude, and disrespectful. The mayor's jaw tightened as he read. He wasn't angry at the people. He was angry at the situation. He knew his wife's temper and he knew she didn't mean harm. But he also knew perception mattered more than intention in politics. When he got home that evening, Helen was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her own phone, visibly irritated. "Did you see what they're saying about me?" she said the moment he walked in. "People are exaggerating. That woman at the cafe tried to embarrass me." Thomas put his briefcase down. "Helen, it's all over social media. You can't keep doing this." "I didn't do anything wrong," she snapped. "I was just standing up for myself." "Standing up for yourself doesn't mean yelling at people who are just doing their jobs," he said, keeping his tone calm but firm. Helen frowned. "You're taking their side?" "I'm trying to protect you," he said quietly. "And frankly, our reputation. This isn't going away unless we handle it right." Helen crossed her arms and looked away. "I'm not apologizing. That would make me look weak," Thomas sighed again. "Sometimes saying sorry isn't about weakness. It's about being smart," but Helen didn't respond. She turned her eyes back to her phone, scrolling through comments as if trying to find at least one person who agreed with her. The next few days were tense. Everywhere Helen went, she could feel people looking at her differently. Some smiled politely but quickly turned away. Others whispered as she passed by. At the grocery store, a woman she used to chat with every week suddenly avoided eye contact. At the gym, conversation stopped when she walked in. For someone who thrived on attention, that quiet judgment felt unbearable. Meanwhile, Alicia went about her life as usual. She didn't think much about the incident anymore. She had cases to handle, clients to meet, and real work to do. But people in town didn't forget her calm response that day. A few local news blogs had even written small articles about her, calling her the voice of reason during a heated moment. One afternoon, Alicia received a call from the city's community board. They asked if she'd be interested in speaking at an upcoming town forum about respect and civility in public spaces. She agreed, thinking it might be a good opportunity to remind people how kindness could go a long way. The event was scheduled for Saturday, exactly 1 week after the cafe incident. When Helen heard about it, she felt a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "They're making her some kind of hero," she said to her husband. "All because she talked back to me?" Thomas looked at her carefully. "Maybe it's a good thing someone's talking about respect. You could go, show that you care about the same message." Helen laughed bitterly. "Show up and sit in the same room as her? I don't think so." But deep down, something inside her was uneasy. She didn't like the idea that people saw her as the villain in a story. She was used to being admired, not criticized. On the day of the forum, the community center filled quickly. Dozens of residents showed up. Teachers, business owners, students, and local officials. The mayor sat quietly near the front, trying to appear composed. Helen sat beside him, her arms folded tightly across her chest, a polite smile frozen on her face. Alicia arrived a few minutes later, greeting people as she walked in. She wasn't dressed to impress, just a simple blouse and slacks, but her calm confidence made people gravitate toward her. When she took the stage, the room grew quiet. "Thank you for being here," she began. "We all share this town, and it's our responsibility to make it a place where everyone feels respected. Whether you're behind a counter or sitting in an office, kindness costs nothing." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. People nodded as she spoke, some even clapping softly. She never mentioned Helen by name, but everyone knew what had inspired the forum. Helen sat stiffly, her jaw tight. She glanced around the room, noticing the approving looks and small smiles directed toward Alicia. The more people clapped, the smaller Helen felt. When the forum ended, Alicia stepped off the stage and began speaking with a few attendees. Thomas went over to shake her hand and thank her for speaking. Helen stayed seated, pretending to check her phone. But as the crowd thinned, she realized Alicia was walking in her direction. "Mrs. Brooks," Alicia said politely, "I just wanted to say I appreciate you coming tonight. It means a lot." Helen looked up, forcing a small smile. "Of course. My husband thought it would be good for us to attend." Alicia nodded. "Well, I hope it shows that we can all learn from moments like these. None of us are perfect." Helen blinked. The comment wasn't meant as an insult. Alicia's tone was kind, genuine even. But something about it made Helen feel defensive. "Some people like to make others look bad to make themselves look good," Helen said quietly. Alicia shook her head slightly. "That's not what I'm trying to do. I just think we all have chances to do better." Before Helen could respond, someone called Alicia's name from across the room, and she excused herself with a polite smile. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. Her husband had gone to bed early, but she sat in the living room staring out the window. Her reflection stared back at her, tired, restless, unsure. For the first time, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: doubt. Doubt about how people saw her, about how she'd acted, and maybe even about who she had become. But instead of admitting it, she told herself that everyone had misunderstood her. "They just don't know the pressure I'm under," she whispered to herself. Still, the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. By the next morning, Helen tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. She went shopping, met a friend for lunch, and posted a few cheerful pictures online. But the likes were fewer, the comments quieter. People were polite but distant. Then something unexpected happened. A local reporter reached out, asking if she'd be willing to give her side of the story. Helen saw it as her chance to fix everything. "Finally," she said, "someone who wants to hear the truth." She invited the reporter to her home that afternoon. She dressed carefully, choosing a soft blue dress that made her look approachable. When the reporter arrived, she greeted her warmly and guided her to the living room. For nearly an hour, Helen spoke about how the cafe staff had been disrespectful, how the lawyer had interfered, and how she felt targeted because of who she was. The reporter listened quietly, nodding and taking notes. When the interview ended, Helen felt lighter, almost relieved. "Make sure people understand my side," she said as the reporter packed up her things. The article came out 2 days later. At first, Helen smiled when she saw her photo in the paper. But as she read the story, her smile faded. The reporter hadn't painted her as the victim she wanted to be. Instead, the tone was neutral, factual, and clear. It quoted her words exactly, but it also included comments from witnesses and local residents who described her behavior as entitled and unnecessary. Helen felt her stomach twist. She had thought she could control the story. Instead, it had only confirmed what people already believed. Later that evening, she sat alone in her garden, watching the sunset fade behind the trees. She thought about everything: the cafe, the lawyer, the officer, the forum, and now the article. For the first time, she couldn't tell if she was angry at everyone else or at herself. She still didn't know it, but the way she handled what came next would decide whether her story ended in redemption or in complete humiliation. And that choice, though it felt far away, was already waiting just around the corner. The days following the newspaper article were uncomfortable for Helen. Every time she went out, she could feel people watching her, even when they said nothing. It wasn't just in her head. The warmth that used to greet her wherever she went had quietly disappeared. She used to walk into shops and hear cheerful greetings, smiles, and small talk about her garden parties or her husband's next event. Now the same people only nodded politely or avoided eye contact. It felt as though she had suddenly become a stranger in the very town she once thought she owned. Her husband, the mayor, had been patient through the whole ordeal. But even his patience was starting to wear thin. He had to attend city meetings where reporters asked about his wife's behavior, and he could no longer shrug it off. Public image mattered, and whether she liked it or not, Helen was part of that image. One evening, after a long day, he came home to find her sitting by the fireplace, a cup of untouched tea in front of her. She looked tired but still held her chin high. He sat down across from her and said quietly, "We need to talk." She didn't look up. "If this is about that article again, I don't want to hear it." "It's not just about the article," he said. "It's about everything. The cafe, the video, the interviews. It's hurting us, Helen. People are losing respect. Helen finally met his eyes. I didn't do anything wrong. I was treated badly and I stood up for myself. He shook his head slowly. You yelled at a young worker. You disrespected someone who tried to help, and now it's all anyone talks about. Whether you believe it or not, that matters. Helen took a deep breath, holding back tears that were equal parts anger and shame. So what am I supposed to do? Pretend I was the bad one, he sighed. No. But maybe it's time to show people that you can take responsibility. Sometimes admitting you went too far doesn't mean you're wrong about everything. It means you care enough to make peace. She didn't respond right away. Deep down, she knew he was right. But her pride was heavy. For years, she had lived in a world where appearances meant everything, where confidence, or at least the appearance of it, was a kind of armor. Taking that armor off felt too vulnerable. That night, she lay awake in bed, replaying every moment in her head. The cafe, the lawyer's calm face, the officer writing the ticket, the whispers, the forum. Every piece fit together like a movie she didn't want to watch. The next morning, she woke up early and stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. For the first time in a long while, she didn't see the polished image of the mayor's wife. She saw someone tired, someone who had lost touch with the world around her. After pacing the house for almost an hour, she made a decision that surprised even her. She picked up the phone and called the cafe. A young voice answered, cheerful but cautious. The Daily Grind, good morning. Helen hesitated. Yes, this is Helen Brooks. I was hoping to speak to your manager if she's available. There was a brief pause. Oh, sure, just a second. Moments later, another voice came on, familiar and calm. This is Lila speaking. Helen swallowed hard. Lila, this is Helen Brooks. I'm calling because, well, I think I owe you and your staff an apology. There was silence on the line for a moment. Then Lila said gently, I appreciate that, Mrs. Brooks. I wasn't fair to your employee that day. Helen continued, her voice softer than usual. And I know I made things difficult. I'm sorry. Lila paused again before replying. Thank you for saying that. I know that wasn't easy. You're welcome to come by any time. Maybe we can start fresh. Helen felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but she still felt nervous. Maybe I will, she said. When she hung up, she sat for a moment, breathing deeply. It was the first time in weeks she felt like she had done something right. That afternoon, she drove downtown. The sun was bright and the air felt crisp. As she parked her car, this time in a proper spot, she caught a few glances from passers-by. But instead of looking away, she gave small smiles. Walking into the Daily Grind again felt strange. The familiar bell over the door jingled and a few heads turned. Conversations dipped for a second before resuming. Lila noticed her right away and walked over with a calm smile. Mrs. Brooks, I wasn't sure you'd actually come. Helen nodded. I almost didn't, but I figured it's about time. The young barista who had taken her order that day was behind the counter again. When their eyes met, Helen offered an awkward but genuine smile. I believe I owe you an apology too, she said softly. He blinked, surprised. Oh, thank you, ma'am. That means a lot. Lila gestured toward a small table by the window. Would you like to sit for a bit? Helen nodded and took a seat. Lila joined her, setting down 2 cups of coffee. I didn't mean for any of this to get so out of hand, Helen said, stirring her drink even though she didn't need to. I was just angry that day. I took it out on the wrong people. Lila nodded. It happens. We all have bad moments. What matters is how we handle what comes after. Helen smiled faintly. I think I forgot that people notice how you treat them more than who you are. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that feels like understanding instead of awkwardness. As they talked quietly, a familiar figure walked through the door, Alicia, holding a folder and her usual calm expression. She looked surprised to see Helen but gave a polite nod. Helen hesitated, then stood up. Alicia, she said, can I have a word? Alicia nodded and joined them at the table. Of course. I just wanted to say, I handled things badly that day. You didn't deserve the way I spoke to you, Helen said, her voice steady but sincere. I was embarrassed and I took it out on you. Alicia looked at her for a moment before replying. Thank you for saying that. I know it's not easy to admit when things get out of hand. Helen smiled, a little uncertain. Maybe it's time I learn. Alicia nodded, smiling gently. We all have those moments. What matters is whether we grow from them. The three women sat there for a few minutes talking about the town, the community, and how quickly stories spread. What surprised Helen most was how natural it felt. No judgment, no tension, just people having an honest conversation. When she left the cafe that afternoon, she felt lighter than she had in months. But change never comes without a few lingering shadows. The next morning, as she scrolled through her phone, she noticed that someone had posted a photo of her sitting in the cafe, talking to Lila and Alicia. The caption read, "Maybe she's learning after all." The comments were mixed. Some people applauded her for apologizing, while others doubted her sincerity. At first, the criticism stung, but this time she didn't react. She realized she couldn't control what people thought. All she could do was show through her actions who she wanted to be moving forward. Over the next few weeks, Helen began volunteering quietly with a local food drive. It wasn't a big public gesture, and she didn't call the press or post photos online. She just showed up, helped organize supplies, and went home. People started noticing. Slowly, the whispers changed. Instead of gossip, there was curiosity. Instead of avoidance, there were small smiles again. Even her husband noticed the change. "You seem different lately," he said one evening. Helen smiled softly. "Maybe I just needed a reminder that people matter more than appearances." He nodded, clearly proud. "That's all I ever wanted you to see." A few days later, Helen received a handwritten note at her door. It was from Alicia. It read, "Growth is never easy, but it's always worth it. You did the right thing. Keep going." Helen folded the note carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. It wasn't something she planned to show anyone, but she kept it as a quiet reminder that even after mistakes, people can change. And that respect, once lost, can be earned again. One small act at a time. That evening, she went for a walk through downtown. The sun was setting, and the same cafe lights glowed warmly through the windows. She could see people inside laughing, talking, and living ordinary lives. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel separate from them. She felt part of something she had almost forgotten she needed. As she passed by the cafe, the barista waved from inside. She smiled back, genuine and easy. Maybe the town hadn't completely forgiven her yet. Maybe some people never would. But she had started something far more important, forgiving herself. And for Helen Brooks, that was the beginning of peace. A few weeks after Helen's first apology at the cafe, the town slowly began to notice the change in her. People who had once avoided her now smiled politely when she passed by. It wasn't immediate forgiveness, and it certainly wasn't universal, but it was progress. Helen herself felt a difference. The sharp tension she carried in her chest for months seemed to ease. Every day she reminded herself that action spoke louder than words and that real respect had to be earned, not demanded. One Saturday morning, she decided to return to the cafe again. Not to make a scene, not to assert her status, but simply to sit, drink her coffee, and watch the town go about its usual rhythm. When she walked in, Lila greeted her warmly. "Good to see you again, Mrs. Brooks." "Good morning, Lila," Helen said, smiling. She took a seat at the same table by the window she had sat at before. This time she didn't order anything complicated. Just a simple black coffee. The barista, the young man who had handled her orders before, gave her a small, polite nod. "Morning, ma'am." Helen returned the nod. She felt a sense of quiet comfort in the ordinary interaction. No tension, no drama, just a simple exchange between people. As she sipped her coffee, she noticed Alicia walk in. Alicia waved briefly and joined the counter line. Helen felt a small flutter of nervousness. Old habits die hard. But she reminded herself this wasn't about ego anymore. It was about connection, respect, and humility. The cafe filled steadily with Saturday regulars. Children laughed as they sipped hot chocolate. Couples whispered to each other over pastries, and the smell of fresh bread mixed with roasted coffee. The normal rhythm of life continued, uninterrupted by drama or power plays. Helen's phone buzzed. It was a message from her husband. "Dinner tonight at the community center. We have volunteers from the food drive. You should come early." She put her phone down and smiled to herself. The food drive had become her quiet project, her way to give back without expectation or recognition. It wasn't public, but it felt more meaningful than any event she had hosted before. Later that day, she arrived at the community center. Volunteers were unloading boxes of food, stacking shelves, and organizing supplies. Helen rolled up her sleeves and jumped in. She moved quickly, listening to instructions, helping wherever she could. It wasn't glamorous and she wasn't in charge, but she didn't mind. As she worked, a few volunteers gave her polite nods and smiles. Some remembered her from before, some had only heard stories, but the small gestures of acknowledgement felt genuine. They weren't about status. They were about shared effort. Alicia arrived a few minutes later carrying a clipboard. She smiled when she saw Helen working alongside everyone. "Good to see you here," she said. Helen wiped her hands on her sleeves. "It feels right, being part of this." "Not standing above it," Alicia nodded. "That's the point. Real influence isn't about power over people. It's about contributing to the community." For the first time, Helen truly understood what that meant. The admiration she used to crave from appearances and titles now seemed empty, compared to the quiet satisfaction of doing something meaningful. As the day went on, Helen noticed people starting to talk more openly with her. A volunteer from the local library shared a story about a new program for children, asking if she'd like to help. Helen agreed without hesitation. Another volunteer asked for advice about organizing a small-town event. She gave suggestions freely, without expectation of praise or recognition. By mid-afternoon, the community center was buzzing with energy, laughter, and chatter. People who had been wary of her before now included her in conversations naturally. She felt a quiet warmth in her chest, not pride, not ego, just connection. After the work was done, Alicia came up to her again. "I have to leave soon," she said. "But I just wanted to say you've done well today. You're making a difference, Helen, and people notice." Helen smiled genuinely this time. "Thank you, it feels better than I imagined. I didn't think I could ever feel like part of the community again." Alicia patted her shoulder lightly. "You've earned it by choosing to change. That's all anyone can do, and it's more than enough." Helen watched as Alicia walked away, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't known in months. It wasn't instant acceptance from everyone, but it was real, and real was enough. That evening, as Helen drove home, she reflected on the past weeks, the cafe incident, the forum, the apologies, the small acts of volunteering. Each step had been uncomfortable, humbling, and challenging, but it had also been necessary. When she arrived home, her husband was waiting. "How was it?" he asked. "Good," she said simply. "Different, but good." He smiled and took her hand. "I'm proud of you. I can see it in how you carry yourself now. It feels lighter." Helen nodded. "It does. I never realized how heavy pride could be until I let it go." Over the next few months, Helen continued to volunteer, attend town events quietly, and interact with residents respectfully. The stories about her entitled behavior gradually faded as people saw her consistent actions. While a few skeptics remained, most began to accept the change because it was undeniable. Actions, after all, spoke louder than words. One afternoon, the mayor received a call from a local TV station. They wanted to feature Helen's volunteer work and her journey of change. Helen was hesitant at first. She didn't want to appear self-congratulatory or gain attention for doing the right thing. After discussing it with her husband and Alicia, she agreed, not for recognition, but to show that change was possible. That story aired a week later. The coverage was warm, highlighting her dedication to the food drive and her efforts to reconnect with the community. The reaction was surprising. Comments online were overwhelmingly positive. People appreciated her sincerity and her willingness to learn. Some even shared their own stories of realizing mistakes and making amends. Helen felt a quiet sense of validation, not because of the attention, but because of the understanding that even mistakes could lead to growth. Months later, the cafe incident was remembered, but not with ridicule or tension. People would occasionally mention it, but now it was part of a story of change rather than shame. The young barista smiled whenever he saw her. Lila would wave warmly, and Alicia often crossed paths with her at community events. Helen had learned that influence and respect were not about asserting authority or demanding recognition. They were about listening, learning, and connecting. Small acts of kindness, sincerity, and humility mattered far more than appearances. One evening, Helen stood on the balcony of her home, looking out over the town she had once thought she controlled with status and privilege. She watched children playing in the park, neighbors chatting on sidewalks, and families laughing together. For the first time, she didn't feel above them. She didn't feel separate. She felt part of it. Part of the life, the community, and the shared humanity that made her town special. Her husband came out, standing beside her quietly. He didn't need to speak. She knew he was proud, not because of a title or a story, but because he had seen her grow. Helen looked at him and then back at the town below. She whispered softly, "I think I finally understand." He smiled. "It took time, but you did. That's what matters. The lessons weren't over and life wasn't perfect. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, and moments of pride that tested her resolve. But Helen now knew that real strength wasn't about winning arguments or asserting status. It was about honesty, humility, and the courage to face one's mistakes. As the sun set behind the hills, bathing the town in golden light, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. She realized that being part of a community meant giving as much as you took, listening as much as you spoke, and treating others with the same respect you hoped to receive. And for Helen Brooks, that realization was more valuable than any title, any privilege, or any power. The town, the cafe, the forum, and even the incident that had started it all, they were no longer sources of shame or frustration. They had become stepping stones toward growth, understanding, and genuine connection. Helen knew she could never undo the past completely, but she could shape the future, and now she intended to do so with integrity, respect, and the kind of humility that made people trust her again. It wasn't a sudden transformation. It was slow, steady, and earned. But in the end, Helen understood the most important lesson of all. True respect isn't demanded, it's given, and that truth finally had changed everything.